Hey, what up, geniuses? We are on 5.3. This video is going to give you some tips for reading the chapter If I Could Pay You Less, I Would, and for analyzing, evaluating, and interpreting this chapter. Because that's what we have to be able to do to score high on paper, too. So let's get to it. First of all, the map that is in the front of the book is helpful for this reading. In this reading, Benji is moving from his house, right? This is his house, the kids with the empty house. He's moving from there to Joni Waffle, and he talks about making a shortcut along the beach. And so you can see how that would be helpful as opposed to having to walk down these streets and, it's sort of out of the way to have to do that. But the problem with walking on the beach, of course, is that then he has to interact with other people. And so he has to play nice with all of the adults who are hanging out on the beach and, make friendly small talk and all of those annoying things that Benji does not like to do. And then we also hear referenced on page 100 the Confederate flag, the truck with the Confederate flag. And so that's right in sort of the crease of your book there. So if you wanted to make notes of those two items, you sure could. Those are going to help you sort of locate where we are in space. So I told you as you're reading this book that it is a slice of life, and that oftentimes when Benji tells us about an event that happened this summer of 1985, he moves into tangents, segues, flashbacks, things that connect to what he's experiencing but that aren't happening right now in the current timeline. And so one way to help you understand the book is to figure out what is the current episode, the current timeline's episode, and to keep that in mind as you're reading each chapter. So for this chapter, the current episode is Benji going to work. He is walking from his house to Joni Waffle, and then he spends a lot of time at Joni Waffle, and we hear about some new characters there and some events that take place there. Also, we notice, the new characters, I should say, that who we meet at Joni Waffle are Martine, Nick, Meg, and Marcia. Martine is the owner of Joni Waffle, the immigrant from the Dominican Republic. Nick is a new character we haven't met yet. He works at Joni Waffle. He's someone who used to be more like NP and Benji, but now he and his mom live on Sag Harbor full time, and so he's actually a townie, and he's a little embarrassed about that fact. He says it's a temporary arrangement, and they don't talk about it at all. Meg and Marcia, we hear about, they are the cousins with the capital C, and Meg is the one that Benji accidentally brushes up against every once in a while, right? Who he has the crush on, who wears her hair over her eye, her lazy eye. One thing, too, that you'll notice about the plot in this chapter is it starts and ends with the same event, or at least a similar event, power outages. At the beginning of the chapter, Benji is complaining about a smell in their house, and it was exacerbated by the power outage. And that power outage was caused by a glitch in paying the utilities bill, according to his mom. But they're out of power for a little while because of that. But power outages are common on Long Island, we're told, at that moment. And then the chapter ends with an actual power outage of all of Long Island, or at least a big chunk of it. And that's when he's at work at Joni Waffle. What is Joni Waffle? Oh, it's the ice cream parlor where he works. It's his first job. We hear some new information about the dad that you might want to include for your character stuff. And it has to do with the difference between how Benji's dad grew up and how Benji grows up. Benji's dad grew up in a low-income house He had no privileges, while Benji has a lot of privileges growing up in a middle class to upper class family as a black kid with a beach house, right? And so there is some tension between his dad and Benji because of the differences in privilege. And take a look at the paragraph on 107 about that. Okay, so we talked about the map. The other interesting thing that we hear about is the history of the neighborhood. On his way to Joni Waffle, we hear about on page 95 a woman named Maud Terry, and she's described as the spiritual architect of the developments. She's the one who first figured out how to sell these plots to other middle-class black residents of Manhattan. And they were all owned by someone named Mr. Gale, who couldn't sell the plots because they were not prime acreage of Bridgehampton, Southampton, etc. And so Maud Terry hatched a plan where she'd sell the lots for him to her friends, friends, and so on, the middle-class black folk of their acquaintance. $750 for an inside lot, $1,000 for a beachfront lot. And so those were the prices in the 1930s and 1940s when they were being sold. So that was an interesting little slice about the history of Sag Harbor. And then on 101 and 102, we learn about, this is as he's approaching Joni Waffle and the wharf, the area along the water. And he's talking about how it was actually referenced in Herman Melville's novel, Moby Dick. One of the most important American novels ever written, probably the most important of the 19th century. And so that was during the whaling boom, and whaling ships would come in and out of Sag Harbor. And then he goes on to talk about this idea about history, where we often hear about things burning up or destroyed by fire. And that is on page 103. And, the idea that things don't last very long from the long ago past because things have been destroyed by fire. And then he says that by 1985, there was a different kind of fire sweeping through Sag Harbor, rebuilding the place. And it has to do with commercialization, tourism, what kinds of things are going to sell along the wharf because of who is visiting. Okay, so that's some stuff to help you with plot and character. When we move on to theme, we're going to see a lot of references to coming of age in the margins. And I think this is a really helpful way to look at being in the margin in this book that I've got in parentheses there. Benji is out of the loop in a lot of ways. That's a good way to look at how he is in the margins. On page 98, we hear that he's imagining having a party. I speak as someone who was not invited to parties and thus had an outsider's perspective. So being in the margins is also about being an outsider, not being in the mainstream. And so that's a good example of it as well. On page 99, we hear about how he took swimming lessons all those seasons and he never really learned how to swim in the proper way. And he talks about the swimming lesson flashbacks that he has as he approaches the public beach and the tormenting echoes of his failure and their reverberations through the years. On 101, he talks about Queequeg, who is a character from Moby Dick, and how he had his own idea or bit of double consciousness about him to embroider a theme. So here is the narrator talking as constructor of the book, a little meta narration there for us. And thus, an old idolater at heart, he's quoting Moby Dick, which is describing Queequeg, a Native American character in the book. He yet lived among these Christians, wore their clothes, and tried to talk their gibberish, hence the queer ways about him, though now some time from home. So interesting that he mentions this double consciousness theme again. In this case, it's thinking about the history of Sag Harbor and specifically the character Queequeg from Moby Dick. 104, we hear that his great plans at the beginning of the summer of going by Ben had been disappointed. So he had given up on friends and family, making the switch, concentrating instead on the understanding strangers of his future acquaintance. So at the beginning of the book, he says, I'm Ben. I'm no longer going by Benji, but of course, everybody still calls him Benji. And so that's his point. He's going to he's going to forget about the past, but move on to people who he may know in the future, and have them call him Ben instead. On 130, he talks about, he sums up the New Coke episode where he tried to steal the 6-pack of Coke by saying, what was the point? Move, don't move, act, don't act. The results were the same. This was my labyrinth. So here we have a labyrinth, a maze that he can't get out of, where he is trying to do the right thing or trying to be cool or trying to get what he wants and is constantly stuck in the same place. On 144, we have the end of the chapter, and here he talks about how he gets sick of dessert after working at Joni Waffle. And he says, it's a terrible thing to hate dessert, to remove yourself from the ways of civilized people. You learn to see things differently from the other side, standing there behind the protective plastic, looking at the normals and their easy pleasure in simple things. And so here he is, the opposite of a normal, looking from the other side of plexiglass. And so that comes back again. We heard that earlier with the binoculars in the first chapter, this idea of being on the other side of glass and looking at people and just being kind of removed from them. Narrative as a quest for understanding comes up really well, I think, in the episode about the head patting incident. Make sure that you read that episode really carefully. I want to talk about this in discussion with you all. The quest of Martine's race on page 113 would have remained academic if not for the head patting incident, which raised the stakes. So how does that incident raise the stakes? Why does it matter if Martine is black or not? And what does that mean to be black or not? And how does this connect to the narrative as a quest for understanding? Dissolving families comes up on 90 and 91. We hear this is also partly why the stench was so bad in his house, because he had closed all the windows because of his father yelling so loudly at his mother one evening, and Benji being embarrassed and wanting to stop the noise from escaping the house. We also hear about the collective over the individual on pages 97 and 98, and he talks about the inhabitants in Sag Harbor as being both survivors and neighbors. Take a look at that part for this theme. All right, moving on to some literary aspects. The narrative voice is hyperbolic. It is exaggerative all the way through. A really good example of this, though, is the "thou shalt not clean thy brother's soup pot" incident on pages 90 to 93. First of all, he describes the dishes in the sink as a ziggurat mess. A ziggurat is a kind of tower from ancient Mesopotamia, the kind that was probably being described in the story about the Tower of Babel. For those of you who had to go to Sunday school and learn about that, one of the highest towers in ancient stories. He talks about the lid of the pot with that old meat and the resulting bugs and maggots as he's holding it closed like it's the gates of hell, using that simile there. And then his description of braces is amazing. Take a look at page 130. Anybody who's had braces, I think, will appreciate this, and it is it's a wonderful example of hyperbolic language. He has a ton of questioning in this chapter. Some interesting questions on page 117 you could take a look at. His direct addresses, where he is breaking that fourth wall by directly addressing the reader, comes up in this section, and a particularly memorable example is on page 121, where he's talking about making the waffle cones sound easy, go F yourself, he tells the reader. Names and self-identifying markers comes up. Nick's new gold chain, his old gold chain was a 2-inch Nick in gold and fake diamonds, right? His new chain says Big Nick in 2-inch letters. Pop culture references to the 1980s. There's some great ones having to do with Nick again, and you could take a look at that on 108, 109, I think. One thing I've noticed about these pop culture references in terms of how people are dressing is the labeling of types of shoes. We hear that Nick wears Adidas, white Adidas with puffy laces. Of course, we heard earlier that Benji wears black Converse, right, for the punk rock look. And the new thing about his brother, Reggie, is that he's been wearing white Fila's and trying to keep them white. So that might be those might be good examples to jot down for pop culture references. For the motif of analytical tools, I think the map serves pretty well here, and sort of tracing the history of Azure Rest and Sag Harbor by using the map and geographical locations. And then the episodic structure, we've got some other episodes in this section besides the current episode, which is going to work and working at Joni Waffle. We also have the soup pot, the head patting incident, the new Coke incident. And then the characterization, one thing that's kind of interesting is looking at NP and Nick as Benji's foils. A foil is a minor character who serves through contrast to bring out important qualities in a major character. So Benji would be that major character, NP and Nick would be the minor characters. And on 117, I think there's a great quote when he's talking about the two of them fighting over Martine's race. He says, "I was in the middle, bending as usual in the direction of whatever breeze was blowing through me that day." Whereas NP is the militant nationalist saying, Martine is not black, and Nick is saying, yeah, he's black, he's one of us, looking for that sort of brotherhood connection and similarity. Benji says, I wasn't either. I was somewhere in the middle and I couldn't really decide. Okay, so those were some tips on this chapter. I hope this was helpful for you, and I look forward to talking about this chapter and the next one in the next discussion.